The morning mist clung to the towering columns of the Jefferson County Courthouse. As 8-year-old Lucy Chen stepped out of her mother's Honda Civic, her small fingers instinctively finding the thick golden fur of her service dog, Max, the massive golden retriever stood perfectly still beside her, his intelligent amber eyes scanning the crowd of reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers who had gathered for what local media was calling the most unusual trial of the decade. Lucy's mother, Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatric surgeon who had saved countless children's lives, felt her own hands trembling as she watched her daughter face the imposing granite steps. 2 years and 4 months ago, Lucy had been a chattering, laughing second grader who never stopped talking. Now, the child who once narrated every moment of her day in an endless stream of observations and questions communicated only through carefully choreographed hand signals that most of the world couldn't understand. The accident had happened on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Lucy had been walking home from Roosevelt Elementary School, her backpack bouncing with each skip, when Jake Morrison's silver BMW had come screaming around the corner at 60 miles per hour. In a 25-mile-per-hour school zone, Morrison, a 34-year-old investment banker with 3 previous DUI arrests, had consumed 6 beers and 2 shots of whiskey during what he called a liquid lunch with clients. Security cameras from the nearby convenience store had captured the horrific moment when his car struck Lucy, sending her small body flying 15 feet through the air before she crashed into a fire hydrant. The impact had caused severe traumatic brain injury, 3 broken ribs, a shattered collarbone, and internal bleeding that required emergency surgery. But the cruelest injury was the one that couldn't be seen on X-rays or MRI scans, the psychological trauma that had stolen Lucy's voice completely. For months after the accident, she hadn't spoken a single word, communicating only through desperate gestures and tear-filled expressions that broke her parents' hearts daily. Enter Max, a 2-year-old golden retriever, who had been specially trained at the Canine Companions facility in Colorado. Max wasn't just any service dog, he was part of an experimental program designed to help children with severe communication disorders. During 6 intensive months of training, Max had learned to recognize over 200 different hand signals, respond to subtle emotional cues, and even perform complex tasks that could help Lucy navigate a world that suddenly seemed impossible to communicate with. The bond between Lucy and Max had developed with an almost supernatural intensity. Where traditional therapy had failed, Max had succeeded in ways that amazed even her medical team. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, Lucy's neuropsychologist, had documented how Lucy's cortisol levels dropped dramatically in Max's presence, and how the child's willingness to attempt communication increased exponentially when her canine companion was nearby. But convincing the legal system to accept this unique form of testimony had been a battle that lasted 8 months. Defense attorney Thomas Blake, a sharp-tongued Harvard graduate known for his aggressive tactics and expensive suits, had filed motion after motion to keep Max out of the courtroom. Blake argued that allowing the dog to participate in testimony was a circus act designed to manipulate the jury's emotions and a dangerous precedent that would turn our courtrooms into petting zoos. Blake's objections weren't entirely unreasonable from a legal standpoint. No court in the United States had ever allowed a service animal to participate directly in witness testimony. The closest precedent was emotional support animals being present during victim testimony. But what prosecutor Maria Santos was proposing was revolutionary. Max wouldn't just provide comfort. He would serve as Lucy's actual voice through their intricate communication system. Judge Patricia Rodriguez, a stern but fair jurist with 15 years on the bench, had spent weeks reviewing medical records, consulting with animal behavior experts, and researching legal precedents from around the world. She had observed private sessions where Lucy and Max demonstrated their communication system, watching in amazement as the child could convey complex thoughts and detailed memories through subtle gestures that Max would interpret and act upon. The breakthrough moment had come during a closed session in Judge Rodriguez's chambers. Lucy had been asked to describe her favorite memory from before the accident. Through a series of hand signals, she had instructed Max to retrieve specific items from around the room: a red pen, a small ball, and a picture of a family, and arrange them in a way that told the story of a family picnic where they had played catch and eaten strawberries. The demonstration had been so clear, so emotionally powerful, that even Blake had remained silent for several minutes afterward. Now, as Lucy climbed the courthouse steps with Max at her side, the weight of legal History pressed down on her small shoulders. Behind them walked her parents, her grandparents, Dr. Martinez, and a team of advocates who had fought tirelessly to give Lucy her day in court. Ahead of them waited a packed courtroom, filled with curious spectators, skeptical lawyers, and a jury who would decide not just Jake Morrison's fate, but whether a new form of justice could emerge from tragedy. The courthouse lobby buzzed with nervous energy as court officers cleared a path for Lucy and Max. Reporters shouted questions that Lucy couldn't answer, cameras flashed, and an overwhelming sensory assault threatened to trigger one of the panic attacks that still plagued her in crowded spaces. But Max sensed the change in her breathing immediately, moving closer to her legs and creating a protective barrier between Lucy and the chaos surrounding them. As they approached the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 3B, Lucy paused and looked up at the inscription carved into the marble archway above. Justice is truth in action. She made a small hand signal to Max, who responded by gently touching his nose to her palm, their secret signal. For we can do this together, today. They would prove that truth could speak louder than words, and that justice could be served by those who had been silenced by tragedy. The doors opened, and Lucy Chen walked into the courtroom that would either validate her unique voice or silence her forever. The heavy steel door of the holding cell clanged shut behind Jake Morrison, as the bailiffs escorted him through the underground tunnel that connected the county jail to the courthouse. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit that had replaced his $1,000 Armani suits, Morrison shuffled forward in shackles, the metallic clink of his chains echoing off the concrete walls with each reluctant step. His once perfectly styled hair hung in greasy strands, and dark circles under his bloodshot eyes revealed the sleepless nights he'd endured since his arrest. Morrison had spent the last 2 years and for months in denial, convincing himself that the accident was just that an unavoidable tragedy that could have happened to anyone. His high-powered legal team, led by the ruthless Thomas Blake, had initially filled him with confidence. Blake had assured him that without the victim's verbal testimony, the prosecution's case would crumble like a house of cards. After all, how could a mute child possibly testify against him? But as Morrison was led into the sterile fluorescent lighting of Courtroom 3B, reality crashed down on him like a sledgehammer. There, sitting in the front row of the gallery, was a small figure he had tried so hard to forget. Lucy Chen looked even tinier than he remembered from the accident scene, her delicate frame dwarfed by the massive golden retriever sitting protectively beside her chair. The sight of her sent a wave of nausea through Morrison's stomach, and his legs nearly buckled beneath him. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was filled with journalists, legal students, disability rights advocates, and curious members of the public who had followed what media outlets were calling the silent witness trial. Court TV cameras had been positioned strategically around the room, broadcasting the proceedings live to millions of viewers across the nation. The attention made Morrison's skin crawl, but it was nothing compared to the way Lucy's dark eyes seemed to bore straight through him. When she turned to look in his direction, Thomas Blake sat at the defense table, his $3,000 suit immaculate, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, and his predatory smile firmly in place. Blake was known throughout the legal community as the Shark, a nickname he wore proudly. In 30 years of practice, he had never lost a case involving vehicular assault, and he wasn't about to start now. His strategy was simple, but brutal. Systematically destroy the credibility of a traumatized child and her circus animal. Before the jury could be swayed by emotion, Blake had spent months researching every aspect of Lucy's condition, consulting with neurologists, psychologists, and animal behavior experts to build his case. He had uncovered inconsistencies in her medical records, questioned the reliability of her memory formation after brain trauma, and prepared expert witnesses who would testify that trained animals could be manipulated to perform specific behaviors that might appear meaningful, but were actually just elaborate tricks. Your Honor, Blake had argued in pretrial motions, we cannot allow our courtroom to become a stage for what amounts to an elaborate performance. This child has suffered terrible trauma, but that does not give the prosecution the right to exploit her condition and parade a trained animal before the jury to elicit sympathy, rather than establish facts. But Judge Rodriguez had seen something in those private chambers that Blake couldn't explain away. She had witnessed Lucy and Max communicate with a complexity and authenticity that went far beyond simple animal training. The judge had watched Lucy convey detailed memories, express complex emotions, and demonstrate cognitive abilities that made it clear her mind was sharp, despite her inability to speak. As Morrison was seated at the defense table, he couldn't shake the memory of that October afternoon when everything in his life had changed. He had been celebrating a major deal with his investment firm, downing drinks at Murphy's Tavern near his office. The alcohol had made him feel invincible, as it always did, and he had dismissed his colleagues' suggestions to call an Uber. His silver BMW had felt like a rocket ship as he sped through the residential streets, music blasting, windows down, completely oblivious to the school's own signs. The impact had happened so fast that Morrison's alcohol-clouded brain had barely registered it at first. One moment he was driving, the next he was sitting in his crumpled car, steam rising from the hood, and people were screaming. It wasn't until he saw the small broken body lying motionless near the fire hydrant that the magnitude of what he had done began to penetrate his intoxicated haze. Morrison had tried to convince himself over the past 2 years that Lucy would recover completely, that children were resilient, that she would eventually speak again and move on with her life. He had even drafted letters of apology that he never sent, imagining a future where he could somehow make amends and be forgiven. But seeing her now, still silent after all this time, still needing a service dog to help her navigate the world, shattered those self-serving delusions. The prosecution table buzzed with activity as Maria Santos, a passionate advocate for victims' rights, organized her files and prepared for what she knew would be the most challenging case of her career. Santos had built her reputation on giving voice to the voiceless, but she had never faced a situation quite like this one. How do you let a silent child tell her story in a system built entirely on verbal testimony? Santos had spent countless hours with Lucy and Max, learning their communication system, understanding the subtle nuances of their interaction, and marveling at the profound bond between them. She had consulted with linguists, animal behaviorists, and child psychologists to ensure that she could properly present Lucy's testimony in a way that would satisfy legal requirements, while preserving the authenticity of the child's experience. The bailiff's voice cut through the courtroom chatter. All rise. The Honorable Judge Patricia Rodriguez presiding. The packed courtroom rose as one, the sound of shuffling feet and creaking benches filling the air. Morrison struggled to his feet, his shackles making the simple movement awkward and humiliating. Judge Rodriguez took her seat behind the imposing mahogany bench, her keen eyes surveying the historic scene before her. She had presided over thousands of cases, but never one that carried such potential to reshape the American legal system. The judge's gaze moved from Morrison to Lucy, and she noticed how the child's small hand rested on Max's head, drawing strength from her faithful companion. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Rodriguez announced, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. We are gathered here today for a trial that may well set new precedents. In American jurisprudence, the defendant, Jacob Morrison, stands accused of vehicular assault while under the influence of alcohol. The victim, Lucy Chen, will testify through means that have never before been attempted in a court of law. Morrison felt his mouth go dry as the judge continued speaking. Blake leaned over and whispered reassurances in his ear, but the words seemed to come from very far away. All Morrison could focus on was Lucy's steady gaze and the way Max seemed to sense every shift in the courtroom's energy. He was about to face judgment not just from a jury of his peers, but from the child whose voice he had stolen and the dog who had become her guardian. Angel Dot, the real battle was about to begin. The moment Lucy Chen stood to approach the witness stand, every person in courtroom 3B seemed to hold their breath collectively. The 8-year-old girl moved with deliberate grace, her small hand resting lightly on Max's golden coat as they walked across the polished hardwood floor. The clicking of Max's nails against the wood created a rhythmic soundtrack that seemed to echo in the cathedral-like silence of the packed courtroom. Max had been trained for this exact moment for over 18 months at the Canine Companions facility in Colorado. He had worked with specialist trainers who understood that he wouldn't just be a comfort animal. He would be Lucy's voice in the most literal sense possible. His training regimen had been unlike anything attempted before in the service dog world. While typical service dogs learn to respond to commands, Max had been taught to interpret an intricate language of subtle gestures, facial expressions, and even breathing patterns that Lucy had developed during her recovery. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the lead animal behaviorist who had overseen Max's training, had documented over 300 distinct signals that Max could recognize and respond to appropriately. These weren't simple commands like sit or stay. They were complex communications that could convey abstract concepts, emotions, memories, and even sequence of events. Max had learned to differentiate between Lucy's signal for scared versus angry, between yesterday and long ago, between maybe and definitely. As Lucy reached the witness stand, court reporter Jeanne Mills prepared her stenotype machine. With trembling fingers, Mills had been transcribing court proceedings for 22 years. But she had never faced a challenge like this. How does one create an official court record of testimony, delivered through hand signals and dog responses? She had spent weeks working with prosecutors to develop a system of notation that could capture the unprecedented form of communication they were about to witness. Judge Rodriguez looked down at Lucy with gentle eyes as the child placed her right hand on a specially modified Bible while raising her left hand. The court interpreter, Maria Elena Santos, no relation to the prosecutor, stood ready to translate Lucy's sign language oath. But what happened next surprised everyone in the courtroom. Lucy made a subtle gesture with her index finger, barely visible to most observers. Max immediately stood, walked to the court reporter's table, and gently picked up a small American flag that had been placed there specifically for this moment. He returned to Lucy and sat perfectly still while holding the flag in his mouth. The symbolism was unmistakable. Lucy was pledging her allegiance to truth and justice through her most trusted companion. "I have never seen anything quite like that," whispered Judge Rodriguez, her professional composure momentarily cracking. The packed gallery buzzed with amazed murmurs until the judge gently tapped her gavel for silence. Prosecutor Maria Santos approached the witness stand with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, but the weight of legal history made her hands slightly unsteady. As she prepared to ask her first question, Santos knew that every word, every gesture, every response would be scrutinized by appellate courts for years to come. "Lucy," Santos began, her voice clear and gentle, "can you tell the court your full name?" What happened next would be replayed on news broadcasts around the world for months afterward. Lucy looked directly at Santos, then made a series of precise hand gestures. Max responded by walking to a specially prepared letter board that had been mounted on an easel near the witness stand. Using his nose with remarkable precision, Max touched letters in sequence, Lucy space CHEN. The courtroom erupted in gasps and amazed whispers. Several jurors leaned forward in their seats, their faces showing expressions of wonder and disbelief. Even Thomas Blake, who had spent months preparing to discredit this exact type of testimony, sat back in his chair with his mouth slightly agape. But Lucy and Max weren't finished with their demonstration. Santos asked, "Lucy, how old are you?" Lucy made another gesture, and Max walked to a set of number cards, carefully selecting the card with 8 written on it and bringing it back to place at Lucy's feet. The questions continued, each answer more impressive than the last. When Santos asked Lucy to describe her favorite color, Lucy signaled to Max, who walked to a box of crayons and selected a bright yellow crayon, bringing it to Lucy. When asked about her favorite food, Max retrieved a plastic apple from a collection of toy foods. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, Lucy's neuropsychologist, watched from the gallery with tears streaming down her face. She had worked with Lucy for over 2 years, witnessing the child's frustration and determination as they developed this communication system together. Dr. Martinez had documented every breakthrough, every moment of progress, every small victory that had led to this incredible display of human-animal partnership. The communication system wasn't just impressive, it was scientifically revolutionary. Lucy had essentially created a new form of language that bridged the gap between human cognitive ability and animal intelligence. Researchers from universities around the world had been following Lucy's case, recognizing that her bond with Max represented a quantum leap in our understanding of interspecies communication. Max's responses weren't just trained behaviors. They demonstrated genuine understanding of abstract concepts. When Santos asked Lucy if she understood the difference between truth and lies, Lucy made a complex gesture that caused Max to perform an extraordinary sequence. He first retrieved a white cloth representing truth and placed it on the left side of the witness stand. Then he retrieved a black cloth representing lies and placed it on the right. Finally, he sat directly next to the white cloth, clearly indicating Lucy's commitment to honesty. The jury was completely captivated. Juror number 3, a retired teacher named Margaret Walsh, later said that watching Lucy and Max communicate was like witnessing a miracle. You could see the intelligence in both their eyes, she recalled. This wasn't a trick or a performance. This was real communication between the beings who trusted each other completely. Thomas Blake scribbled furious notes as he watched his carefully constructed defense strategy begin to crumble. He had prepared expert witnesses to testify that animal responses were unreliable, that traumatic brain injury could create false memories, that the entire display was essentially an elaborate magic trick. But the authenticity of Lucy and Max's interaction was undeniable. The subtle nuances, the split-second timing, the obvious emotional connection between them couldn't be faked or coached. As Santos continued her preliminary questioning, establishing Lucy's identity and her relationship with Max, the true magnitude of what they were witnessing began to dawn on everyone present. This wasn't just a trial, it was a demonstration that communication transcends language. That truth can be expressed in ways that go far beyond spoken words. Judge Rodriguez found herself completely absorbed in the testimony. In her 30 years of legal experience, she had seen many forms of evidence and testimony, but nothing had prepared her for the profound authenticity of Lucy and Max's communication. Every gesture was purposeful, every response was immediate and appropriate, and the obvious love and trust between the girl and her dog created an atmosphere of honesty that no amount of legal maneuvering could undermine. The real test was about to come. Santos was finished with her preliminary questions, and now it was time for Lucy to tell her story about the day that changed her life forever. The courtroom fell silent again as Santos prepared to ask the question that everyone had been waiting for. Lucy, can you tell us what happened on the day of October 15th, 2 years ago? Thomas Blake rose from his chair like a predator emerging from tall grass, his 6'3" friend casting a long shadow across the courtroom floor, his steel-gray eyes fixed on Lucy, with the cold calculation of a hunter who had spotted wounded prey. For 30 years, Blake had built his reputation on one simple principle: destroy your opponent's credibility before they could establish emotional connection with the jury. Today, that opponent was an 8-year-old girl who couldn't speak, and Blake intended to show no mercy. Blake's $500 per hour legal strategy was built on a foundation of brutal psychological warfare. He had spent months studying Lucy's medical records, consulting with neurologists who specialized in traumatic brain injury, and interviewing child psychologists who could testify about the unreliability of memories formed during trauma. His briefcase contained expert testimony that would systematically dismantle every aspect of Lucy's credibility, starting with her mental capacity and ending with accusations of elaborate coaching by desperate parents seeking financial compensation. "Good morning, Lucy," Blake began, his voice dripping with false sweetness that made several jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats. He positioned himself directly in front of the witness stand, towering over the small girl like a giant confronting a fairy tale character. Max immediately sensed the shift in energy, his muscles tensing as his protective instincts kicked into high gear. Blake's first line of attack targeted Lucy's cognitive abilities. "Lucy, do you understand what it means to tell a lie?" His tone was condescending, as if he were speaking to a toddler rather than an intelligent 8-year-old. Lucy's hands began to tremble slightly as she made a gesture toward Max, who responded by touching his nose to a card-marked yes with unmistakable clarity. "But how can we be sure you understand complex concepts when your brain was severely damaged in the accident?" Blake's voice grew sharper, more aggressive. "Isn't it true that traumatic brain injury can cause confusion, false memories, and an inability to distinguish between reality and imagination?" The courtroom fell silent except for the sound of pencils scratching on notepads, as reporters captured every word. Lucy's mother, Dr. Sarah Chen, gripped the wooden bench so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She wanted to leap from her seat and protect her daughter from this verbal assault, but she knew that any interruption could jeopardize Lucy's testimony. Blake continued his methodical destruction. "Lucy, you were only 6 years old when this accident occurred. Isn't it possible that your memories of that day have been influenced by conversations you've overheard between your parents and their lawyers?" His accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, suggesting that Lucy's entire testimony was nothing more than adult manipulation of a damaged child's mind. Lucy's breathing became shallow and rapid. Max immediately moved closer to her chair, his warm body providing physical comfort as her stress levels spiked. The golden retriever's trained instincts told him that Lucy was approaching the danger zone, where panic attacks had previously overwhelmed her ability to communicate effectively. Blake noticed Max's movement and pounced on it like a shark sensing blood in the water. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, observe how this animal has been trained to respond to specific triggers. This is not genuine communication. This is an elaborate performance designed to manipulate your emotions and cloud your judgment. The defense attorney pulled out a thick folder filled with research papers and expert opinions. I have here testimony from Dr. Marcus Weinstein, a leading expert in animal behavior from Stanford University, who will testify that what you're witnessing is nothing more than sophisticated conditioning. This dog has been trained to respond to subtle cues that most people can't detect, creating the illusion of meaningful communication. Blake's voice grew louder, more commanding. The prosecution wants you to believe that this child and this animal have developed some miraculous form of communication that transcends human language. But the truth is much simpler and much more disturbing. This is a carefully orchestrated deception designed to exploit your natural sympathy for an injured child. Lucy's hands were shaking visibly now, and tears began to form in her dark eyes. The emotional trauma of Blake's attack was triggering memories of the helplessness she had felt during the early days after her accident, when no one could understand her desperate attempts to communicate her needs, fears, and pain. Blake pressed his advantage, sensing Lucy's growing distress. Isn't it convenient that this supposed communication system only developed after your parents hired expensive lawyers to pursue this lawsuit? Isn't it suspicious that you can allegedly remember complex details about the day of the accident, but you needed months of training with this animal to supposedly express those memories? Prosecutor Maria Santos jumped to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness and making statements rather than asking questions. Judge Rodriguez sustained the objection, but the damage was already done. Blake had planted seeds of doubt in the jurors' minds about Lucy's motivations and the authenticity of her testimony. Blake smoothly transitioned to his next line of attack. Lucy, your family is seeking millions of dollars in damages from Mr. Morrison. Isn't that correct? He gestured toward the defense table, where Morrison sat looking increasingly uncomfortable with his attorney's tactics. Don't you think it's possible that your parents have unconsciously influenced you to remember things in a way that would help them win money? The suggestion that Lucy's parents had manipulated her testimony for financial gain struck like a lightning bolt through the courtroom. Several jurors exchanged glances, their expressions showing the first signs of skepticism about Lucy's credibility. Blake had successfully introduced the poisonous idea that the entire case might be motivated by greed rather than justice. Max's protective instincts reached a crescendo as he sensed Lucy's emotional state deteriorating rapidly. The dog positioned himself between Lucy and Blake, his usually gentle demeanor shifting to something more alert and guarded. Max had been trained never to show aggression, but his body language clearly communicated that he considered Blake a threat to Lucy's well-being. Blake noticed Max's protective positioning and used it as another weapon in his arsenal. Your Honor, I must point out that this animal is now showing signs of aggression toward me, simply for asking legitimate questions. This demonstrates exactly why animals have no place in a courtroom. They respond to emotion rather than logic, and they can't distinguish between appropriate questioning and actual threats. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, watching from the gallery, felt her heart breaking as she witnessed months of therapeutic progress being systematically demolished by Blake's ruthless cross-examination. She had worked tirelessly with Lucy to build her confidence and communication skills, and now she was watching a grown man use his legal training to terrorize a traumatized child. Blake saved his most devastating attack for last. Lucy, I want you to think very carefully about this next question. Is it possible, just possible, that some of the things you think you remember about the day of the accident are actually things you've been told by other people, or things you've seen in nightmares, or things your mind has made up to fill in gaps in your memory? The question struck at the heart of Lucy's deepest fears. During the early months of her recovery, she had struggled with exactly this uncertainty, not knowing whether her memories were real or manufactured by her traumatized mind. Blake had found her psychological weak point and was exploiting it. With surgical precision, Lucy's composure finally began to crumble. Her small shoulders shook with silent sobs, and her hands moved erratically as she tried to signal to Max through her emotional distress. The courtroom watched in uncomfortable silence as an 8-year-old girl wrestled with doubts about her own memories while facing down one of the most ruthless defense attorneys in the state. But Max had been trained for exactly this moment. As Lucy's distress reached its peak, the golden retriever made a decision that would change everything. The tension in Courtroom 3B had reached a suffocating crescendo as Thomas Blake prepared to deliver what he believed would be the final blow to Lucy Chen's credibility. His silver tongue had already planted seeds of doubt in the jurors' minds, and now he moved in for the kill with the precision of a master executioner. Blake's eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction as he watched Lucy's small frame trembling in the witness chair, her connection with Max becoming increasingly erratic. Under the sustained psychological assault, Lucy, Blake's voice cut through the courtroom silence like a blade. "I'm going to ask you a very simple question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." He paused dramatically, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the packed courtroom like a heavy blanket. "You can't even speak, can you? How can anyone in this courtroom trust the testimony of a child who is so brain damaged that she can't form words?" The collective gasp from the gallery was audible. Several jurors visibly recoiled at Blake's cruelty, but the defense attorney pressed forward, sensing victory within his grasp. Judge Rodriguez's hand moved toward her gavel, but she hesitated, knowing that any interruption might be grounds for a mistrial, exactly what Blake was hoping for. Lucy's breathing became rapid and shallow, the telltale signs of a full-blown panic attack beginning to manifest. Her small hands clutched the arms of the witness chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and beads of perspiration formed on her forehead despite the courtroom's air conditioning. Max sensed the dramatic shift in Lucy's physiological state. Immediately her heart rate had spiked. Her breathing pattern had changed, and the familiar scent of fear-induced adrenaline filled his sensitive nostrils. Blake continued his merciless attack, his voice growing louder and more aggressive with each word. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are being asked to convict my client based on the supposed testimony of a child whose brain was so severely damaged that she lost the most basic human ability, speech itself. How can we trust her memory when her own mind betrayed her so completely?" Dr. Sarah Chen, Lucy's mother, felt her chest tighten as she watched her daughter's emotional state deteriorate before the eyes of hundreds of spectators. As a pediatric surgeon, she had witnessed countless medical emergencies, but nothing had prepared her for the helpless agony of watching her child being systematically destroyed by a legal predator. Her husband, Professor David Chen, reached over and grasped her hand, both parents feeling utterly powerless to protect their daughter from this courtroom crucifixion. The packed gallery buzzed with uncomfortable murmurs as Blake's attack reached new depths of cruelty. Disability rights advocates, who had come to support Lucy's groundbreaking case, sat in stunned silence, horrified by the legal system's tolerance for such treatment of a vulnerable child. Court TV cameras continued rolling, broadcasting Blake's ruthless cross-examination to millions of viewers across the nation, many of whom were beginning to question whether justice could truly be served in a system that allowed such tactics. Max's training had prepared him for many scenarios, but nothing quite like this. His 18 months of specialized education at Canine Companions had included extensive work on recognizing and responding to Lucy's panic attacks, but those training sessions had occurred in controlled environments with supportive handlers. Here, in the hostile atmosphere of a courtroom filled with aggressive energy and negative emotions, Max faced his greatest challenge as Lucy's communication partner. Blake sensed that Lucy was on the verge of complete emotional collapse and decided to deliver his coup de grace. "Tell me, Lucy, how do we know that any of this elaborate dog and pony show is real? How do we know that your parents haven't simply trained you and this animal to perform tricks designed to fool this jury into giving them millions of dollars?" The accusation hit Lucy like a physical blow, the suggestion that her months of painful recovery, her painstaking development of communication skills with Max, and her desperate attempts to find her voice again were nothing more than an elaborate fraud designed to steal money cut deeper than any of Blake's previous attacks. Lucy's composure, which had been hanging by the thinnest of threads, finally snapped completely. Silent tears began streaming down Lucy's face as her body shook with suppressed sobs. Her hands moved frantically, making desperate gestures toward Max, but her movements were so erratic and panicked that even her faithful companion struggled to read her signals clearly. The communication system that had taken years to develop was breaking down under the extreme stress of Blake's psychological warfare. Blake noticed Lucy's deteriorating state and pressed his advantage with ruthless efficiency. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the moment we ask the hard questions, the moment we demand real answers instead of circus tricks, this entire charade falls apart. This child cannot handle the pressure of real cross-examination because she knows, deep down, that her testimony is a fabrication. Judge Rodriguez finally intervened, her voice cutting through Blake's tirade with judicial authority. Counsel, you will moderate your tone and conduct yourself with appropriate decorum in my courtroom. But even the judge's intervention came too late to prevent the damage that Blake's words had inflicted on Lucy's fragile emotional state. In the gallery, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, Lucy's neuropsychologist, watched in horror as months of therapeutic progress evaporated before her eyes. She had worked tirelessly with Lucy to build her confidence, to help her develop trust in her own memories and abilities, and to create the communication system with Max that had given Lucy hope for the first time since her accident. Now she was witnessing that carefully constructed foundation being demolished by a legal system that seemed more interested in winning than in truth. Max's protective instincts reached a critical threshold as he witnessed Lucy's complete emotional breakdown. The golden retriever had been trained to provide comfort and support, but he had also been trained to recognize when Lucy was in genuine psychological danger. His specialized education had included scenarios where he might need to take extraordinary action to protect Lucy's well-being. But those theoretical situations were about to become terrifyingly real. Lucy's panic attack intensified, her hyperventilation, making it difficult for her to focus on anything except the overwhelming sense of helplessness that Blake's words had triggered. The courtroom began to spin around her as oxygen deprivation affected her already traumatized brain, as she felt herself slipping back into the dark place she had inhabited during the early days after her accident, a place where communication was impossible and hope seemed forever lost. Blake prepared to deliver what he believed would be the final blow to Lucy's credibility. I submit to this jury that we have just witnessed the complete breakdown of the prosecution's entire case. This child cannot handle the basic responsibility of testimony because her injuries have left her mentally incapable of distinguishing between truth and fantasy. But as Blake spoke those devastating words, Lucy made a gesture that was almost invisible to everyone in the courtroom, everyone except Max. It was a signal they had never practiced in training, a desperate communication born from pure instinct and love. Lucy's trembling fingers moved in a pattern that seemed to say, "Help me be brave. Help me show them the truth." Max understood immediately. In that moment of crisis, with Lucy's emotional state hanging in the balance and her credibility under sustained attack, the specially trained golden retriever made a decision that would redefine the boundaries between human and animal communication forever. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most extraordinary moments in American legal history. In the breathless silence that followed Lucy's desperate signal, Max's amber eyes locked on hers with an intensity that seemed to transcend the chaos surrounding them. For 18 months, they had practiced hundreds of communication sequences. But this moment called for something beyond training. It demanded the pure, instinctive bond that had formed between a traumatized child and her guardian angel. Max's entire body seemed to vibrate with purpose as he recognized not just Lucy's gesture, but the profound trust she was placing in him to save them both. What happened next unfolded with such elegant simplicity that it took several seconds for the packed courtroom to fully comprehend the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Max rose from his position beside Lucy's chair with fluid grace, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He walked directly to the evidence table where Prosecutor Maria Santos had carefully arranged the physical evidence from the case photographs, medical records, and most importantly, a detailed scale model of the intersection where the accident had occurred. The courtroom held its collective breath as Max approached the miniature street scene. The model, created by forensic specialists, included tiny buildings, street signs, crosswalks, and even miniature vehicles positioned exactly as they had been on that fateful October afternoon. Among the small cars was a silver BMW sedan, identical in every detail to Jake Morrison's vehicle, positioned at the exact point where the collision had taken place. Without hesitation, Max gently grasped the tiny BMW in his mouth and carried it back toward Lucy, but instead of simply delivering it to her as he had been trained to do with other objects, Max did something extraordinary. He placed the model car on the floor directly in front of the witness stand and began to move it in a slow, deliberate pattern that mirrored the actual path Morrison's vehicle had taken. On the day of the accident, the golden retriever's movements were precise and purposeful, displaying a level of spatial intelligence that left even the most skeptical observer speechless. Max pushed the model car with his nose, recreating Morrison's route from his house to the intersection, including the crucial detail of how the vehicle had swerved erratically before striking Lucy. The dog's demonstration was so accurate that it matched perfectly with the forensic reconstruction that had taken investigators months to complete. Judge Patricia Rodriguez found herself leaning forward in her chair, her judicial composure completely abandoned as she watched this unprecedented display of communication. In 30 years on the bench, she had seen expert witnesses with advanced degrees struggle to explain complex evidence to juries. Yet here was a dog providing testimony that was clearer and more compelling than anything she had ever witnessed. In her courtroom, the demonstration continued as Max positioned himself at the exact spot where Lucy had been standing. When Morrison's car struck her, the retriever lay down on the floor, representing Lucy's position after the impact, then slowly moved to show how her body had been thrown through the air. Before landing near the fire hydrant, the reenactment was so detailed, so emotionally powerful, that several jurors were openly weeping. Thomas Blake, who had been frozen in shock since Max began his demonstration, finally found his voice. "Objection," he shouted, his usual composure shattered. "This is exactly the kind of theatrical manipulation I warned about. This animal is performing tricks, not providing testimony." But Judge Rodriguez was having none of it, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made Blake step backward. She overruled the objection with a voice that carried the full weight of her judicial authority. "Counsel, I have been practicing law for 35 years, and I have never seen evidence presented with such clarity and authenticity. This objection is overruled, and you will remain silent while this witness completes her testimony." Max wasn't finished with his remarkable demonstration, responding to another subtle signal from Lucy, a signal so slight that most observers missed it entirely. The golden retriever walked to a different section of the evidence table and retrieved a small toy figure representing a child. He placed the figure at the intersection model, showing exactly where Lucy had been when she first saw Morrison's car approaching. The dog's actions continued to unfold like a precisely choreographed dance of truth. Max moved the child figure to show how Lucy had tried to get out of the way. When she realized Morrison's car was not going to stop, he demonstrated how she had stumbled, how she had fallen, and how Morrison's vehicle had struck her with devastating force. Every movement was measured, deliberate, and heartbreakingly accurate. Jake Morrison, who had been sitting at the defense table trying to maintain his composure, finally broke down completely. Watching Max recreate the accident with such precision forced Morrison to confront the full horror of what his drunk driving had done to Lucy. His shoulders shook with sobs as he buried his face in his hands, unable to watch any more of the devastating testimony. The jury was transfixed by Max's demonstration, but what impressed them most was not the dog's intelligence. It was the obvious authenticity of his actions. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no signs that Max was simply performing trained behaviors. Instead, his movements displayed a deep understanding of the events he was recreating, an understanding that could only have come from Lucy's own memories transmitted through their extraordinary communication system. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Max's original trainer from Canine Companions, watched from the gallery with tears streaming down her face. She had trained hundreds of service dogs during her career, but she had never witnessed anything approaching the level of cognitive sophistication that Max was displaying. This wasn't just communication, it was collaborative storytelling between species, a form of testimony that transcended the boundaries of traditional legal procedure. As Max completed his demonstration, he returned to Lucy's side and made direct eye contact with her. In that moment, something profound passed between them, a shared understanding that they had accomplished something extraordinary together. Lucy's panic attack began to subside as she realized that Max had found a way to tell her story more powerfully than words ever could. The courtroom remained in stunned silence as the full impact of what they had witnessed began to sink in. Max had not just provided testimony, he had created a three-dimensional recreation of the crime that was more detailed and convincing than any expert witness could have provided. His demonstration had answered every question about the accident, established Morrison's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt, and proven once and for all that the communication between Lucy and Max was genuine, profound, and utterly authentic, Thomas Blake slumped in his chair, his carefully constructed defense strategy lying in ruins around him. His expert witnesses, his psychological theories, his accusations of coaching and manipulation, all of it had been demolished by a golden retriever who understood truth in ways that transcended human language. Judge Rodriguez looked out over her courtroom, knowing that she had just presided over a moment that would reshape American jurisprudence forever. The precedent being set here would extend far beyond this single case, opening doors for countless other victims who had been silenced by disability, trauma, or circumstance. But most importantly, Lucy Chen had found her voice not through words, but through the unwavering loyalty and extraordinary intelligence of her four-legged guardian angel. As Max settled beside her chair once more, Lucy made one final signal, and Max responded by gently placing his paw on her hand. The message was clear to everyone in the courtroom. Together, they had spoken truth more powerfully than any words could ever express. Judge Patricia Rodriguez stood slowly behind her mahogany bench, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them flat on the polished wood surface. The weight of 35 years of judicial experience pressed down on her shoulders as she prepared to make a decision that would ripple through the American legal system for generations to come. The packed courtroom remained in absolute silence, every eye fixed on a distinguished woman who held the power to validate or dismiss the most extraordinary testimony in legal history. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Rodriguez began, her voice carrying a gravity that seemed to fill every corner of the vast courtroom. In 3.5 decades of serving on this bench, I have presided over thousands of cases, witnessed countless forms of evidence, and heard testimony from every type of witness imaginable. But what I have observed here today transcends every precedent, every legal framework, and every assumption I have held about the nature of truth and justice. The judge paused, her eyes moving from Lucy's small figure in the witness stand to Max, who sat alertly beside her, then to the scale model that still bore evidence of their remarkable demonstration. When I first agreed to allow a service animal to participate in witness testimony, I did so based on medical evidence and legal precedent regarding accommodation for disabled witnesses. I thought I was simply making a reasonable adjustment to help a traumatized child communicate her experience. Judge Rodriguez's voice grew stronger, more resolute with each word. What I witnessed instead was nothing short of a miracle of communication, a demonstration of trust, intelligence, and authenticity that has fundamentally changed my understanding of what constitutes valid testimony in a court of law. Thomas Blake rose from his chair one final time, desperation evident in his voice. Your Honor, I must object to any ruling that validates this elaborate performance. The defense has constitutional rights that are being violated by— Sit down, Counselor, Judge Rodriguez commanded with such authority that Blake immediately complied, his face flushing red with humiliation. You have spent this entire trial attempting to destroy the credibility of a child who has already suffered more trauma than most adults endure in a lifetime. Your tactics have been not only unsuccessful, but morally reprehensible. The judge's criticism of Blake sent shockwaves through the legal community members present in the gallery. Judge Rodriguez was known for her measured temperament in diplomatic language, but her obvious disgust with Blake's methods was unprecedented in her courtroom. I hereby rule that the testimony provided by Lucy Chen, communicated through her service animal Max, is not only admissible, but represents the most credible and compelling evidence presented in this case. Judge Rodriguez announced. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs, while she continued without pause. Furthermore, I am establishing new legal precedent that recognizes specially trained service animals as legitimate communication aids for witnesses with disabilities. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, Lucy's neuropsychologist, felt her heart soar as she heard the judge's words. Years of research, months of therapy sessions, and countless hours of training with Lucy and Max had culminated in this moment of unprecedented legal recognition. The implications extended far beyond this single case. Judge Rodriguez was opening doors for thousands of disabled individuals who had been silenced by a legal system that couldn't accommodate their unique communication needs. Judge Rodriguez wasn't finished with her historic ruling. I am directing the court stenographer to create a detailed record of the communication methods demonstrated here today. which will serve as a template for similar cases throughout our judicial system. This case will be formally designated as Chen v. Morrison, establishing precedent for what I am calling assisted animal communication in legal proceedings. The packed gallery erupted in spontaneous applause, led by disability rights advocates, who had traveled from across the country to witness this groundbreaking case. Judge Rodriguez allowed the applause to continue for several moments before raising her hand for silence. But this ruling goes beyond legal precedent, the judge continued, her voice taking on a more personal tone. What I witnessed today was a profound demonstration of the bond between human and animal. That speaks to something fundamental about the nature of communication itself. Lucy Chen and Max have shown us that truth can be expressed in ways that transcend spoken language, and that authenticity can be recognized even in the absence of traditional verbal testimony. Jake Morrison, who had been sobbing quietly at the defense table throughout the judge's ruling, suddenly stood up. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his face streaked with tears as he faced Judge Rodriguez. "Your Honor," he said in a broken voice, "I need to say something." Blake grabbed Morrison's arm, trying to pull him back into his seat. "Jake, don't say anything. We can appeal this ruling." Morrison shook off his attorney's grip and looked directly at Lucy. "For the first time since the trial began, I'm guilty," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Everything that little girl and her dog showed you is true. I was drunk, I was driving too fast, and I destroyed her life. I don't deserve mercy, and I don't want an appeal." The courtroom exploded in shocked murmurs as Morrison's confession validated everything Lucy and Max had communicated. Judge Rodriguez studied Morrison's face, recognizing the genuine remorse that had replaced his earlier defiance. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Rodriguez said gravely, "your confession is noted and will be entered into the record. However, this trial will continue to its conclusion because the precedent being established here is larger than any individual case." The judge turned her attention back to the jury, who had been watching the proceedings with expressions of amazement and emotional investment. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have witnessed something unprecedented in American jurisprudence. When you deliberate, I want you to consider not just the evidence presented, but the courage displayed by a young girl who refused to let trauma silence her voice forever." Judge Rodriguez's final words carried the weight of judicial history. This case represents a fundamental expansion of our understanding of justice, communication, and the rights of disabled individuals to participate fully in our legal system. Lucy Chen and Max have proven that silence does not equal voicelessness, and that truth can speak in languages we are only beginning to understand. As the judge prepared to adjourn for jury deliberation, she made one final unprecedented gesture. She stepped down from her bench and approached Lucy's witness stand, kneeling down to bring herself to eye level with the 8-year-old girl, Lucy. Judge Rodriguez said softly, her formal judicial demeanor replaced by genuine warmth, "You have shown more courage in this courtroom than most adults display in their entire lives. You and Max have changed the law, changed our understanding of communication, and given hope to countless individuals who thought their voices could never be heard." Lucy made a small gesture to Max, who responded by touching his nose gently to the judge's outstretched hand. In that simple interaction, Judge Rodriguez felt the profound connection that had made this extraordinary testimony possible. "Court is adjourned for jury deliberation," Judge Rodriguez announced as she returned to her bench. "But let the record show that justice has already been served here today, through the courage of a little girl and the loyalty of her remarkable companion." As the courtroom began to empty, legal scholars, journalists, and advocates knew they had witnessed a watershed moment in American law, a day when justice expanded its definition and truth found a new voice. 6 months after the verdict that sent Jake Morrison to prison for 7 years, Lucy Chen stood on the marble steps of the United States Capitol building, her hand resting on Max's golden coat as camera flashes illuminated the crisp autumn morning. The same girl who had once trembled in a courtroom witness stand now faced a gathering of senators, congressmen, and national media with quiet dignity that belied her 9 years. Today marked the introduction of the Lucy Chen Communication Rights Act, federal legislation that would guarantee disabled individuals the right to testify using assistive communication. Methods include specially trained service animals. The transformation in Lucy over those 6 months had been nothing short of miraculous. Though the journey had been far from easy, in the weeks immediately following the trial, she had experienced what Dr. Rebecca Martinez called post-testimony trauma a complex emotional response to having relived her accident so publicly and intensely. There were nights when Lucy woke up screaming silently, her body shaking with memories of Blake's cruel cross-examination and the overwhelming pressure of speaking for disabled children everywhere. But Max had been there through every setback, every nightmare, every moment of doubt. The golden retriever seemed to understand that his role had evolved beyond simple communication assistance. He had become Lucy's anchor to hope, her reminder that even in the darkest moments, she was never truly alone. During particularly difficult therapy sessions, Max would position himself between Lucy and the door, creating a physical barrier that said more clearly than words, "We face this together." The breakthrough in Lucy's recovery came during a visit to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where she and Max had been invited to meet other young patients struggling with communication disorders. 8-year-old Marcus Williams, who had lost his ability to speak after a stroke, sat in his wheelchair looking defeated and hopeless until Lucy knelt beside him and made a simple gesture. Max immediately responded by bringing Marcus a toy dinosaur, the boy's favorite, which he had somehow selected from among dozens of other toys. Marcus's eyes lit up with wonder and possibility. If Lucy could communicate through Max, perhaps he could learn similar techniques with his own therapy dog. That moment sparked what would become the Lucy's Legacy program, a nationwide initiative to train service animals specifically for communication assistance. With disabled children, the program's success stories multiplied rapidly across the country. In Texas, a teenage girl named Sarah Rodriguez, who had been mute since childhood trauma, learned to communicate through her border collie, Ranger. Their testimony in a child abuse case led to the conviction of her abuser and inspired other young victims to come forward. In Oregon, a boy with severe autism named Timothy Chen, no relation to Lucy, developed an extraordinary communication system with his German Shepherd, Apollo, allowing him to express complex thoughts and emotions for the first time in his life. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had originally trained Max at Canine Companions, found herself at the center of a revolution in animal-assisted therapy. Universities across the globe began establishing research programs to study the cognitive mechanisms behind human-animal communication partnerships. Harvard Medical School launched the Chen Morrison Institute for Interspecies Communication, dedicated to advancing the scientific understanding of how traumatized minds could heal. Through animal partnerships, the legal implications of Judge Rodriguez's precedent-setting ruling continued to reverberate through courtrooms nationwide. The Chen standard became the benchmark for evaluating non-traditional testimony, and law schools began teaching courses on disability accommodation in legal proceedings. Thomas Blake, whose career had effectively ended after his cruel treatment of Lucy, found himself studying these very courses as he attempted to rebuild his professional reputation through advocacy for disabled witnesses, a ironic twist that Lucy herself had suggested during a victim offender mediation session. Jake Morrison's journey toward redemption began in his prison cell, where he spent his days writing letters to Lucy that his counselor helped him send. Initially, Lucy couldn't bear to hear his words, but as her healing progressed, she asked her mother to read them aloud. Morrison's letters chronicled his own path from denial to accountability, his participation in prison alcohol treatment programs, and his work with other inmates struggling with addiction. In his most recent letter, Morrison had written, "Lucy and Max didn't just tell the truth about what I did, they showed me the truth about who I could become." The most remarkable development came during Lucy's 9th birthday celebration, when, surrounded by family, friends, and Max, she whispered her first words since the accident. "Thank you, Max." The words were barely audible, but they represented a victory that medical experts had deemed nearly impossible. Dr. Martinez documented that Lucy's speech recovery appeared to be directly connected to her emotional healing and her growing confidence. As an advocate for other disabled children, Lucy's voice continued to strengthen gradually, though she chose to maintain her communication partnership with Max, even as her verbal abilities returned. During congressional testimony supporting the Communication Rights Act, Lucy spoke aloud for the first time in public, her clear young voice carrying through the packed hearing room. "Max didn't just give me my voice back, he taught me that there are many ways to speak the truth, and all of them are important." The legislation passed unanimously in both houses of Congress, signed into law by a president who invited Lucy and Max to the White House for the ceremony. The Rose Garden event featured children from across the country who had benefited from communication assistance programs inspired by Lucy's case. Each child was paired with their own specially trained animal partner, creating a powerful visual testament to the transformative power of interspecies communication. As Lucy approached her 10th birthday, she and Max had become international symbols of resilience and hope. Their story had been translated into dozens of languages, inspiring similar legal reforms in countries around the world. The European Union established its own communication rights legislation, while countries like Canada, Australia, and Japan developed specialized training programs for communication assistance animals. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy was found in the quiet moments, the countless children who had learned to trust again, the families who had discovered new ways to connect, and the legal system that had expanded its definition of voice and testimony. Judge Rodriguez, now retired, kept a photograph on her desk of Lucy and Max visiting a school for disabled children, surrounded by dozens of young faces filled with hope and possibility. On a warm spring morning, almost 3 years after that historic trial, Lucy stood in the same courthouse where her journey had begun. This time, she was there as an advocate, helping another young girl prepare to testify with her own communication assistance dog. As Lucy knelt beside the frightened child, Max approached with gentle steps and rested his graying muzzle against the girl's trembling hand. "He knows you're scared," Lucy said softly, her voice now strong and clear, "but he also knows you're brave, and sometimes being brave just means letting someone help you find your voice, even if that someone has 4 paws and a tail." The legacy of Lucy Chen and Max had become larger than either of them could have imagined, a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a girl and her guardian angel, who had taught the world that truth has many voices and all of them deserve to be heard.